So hello, and thank you for joining this session of the McGill Executive Institute's Level Up webinar series. My name is Eric Sain, and it's a pleasure to welcome you. I see that we have people from literally around the world. It's great to see, from Laval right here in our nearby Montreal to Hong Kong, Paris, Denver, etc. So great, thanks again for joining. This session is going to last 1 hour and include time to answer your questions. Although you'll be muted as you go through this program, we do want this to be a very interactive session. So you'll have chances to post your questions or comments in the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Also, for better viewing, we recommend you turn off your video image by clicking on Stop Video in the lower left-hand corner. The session will be recorded and shared with you afterwards. So we're very proud to welcome your webinar leader for today, Jane Reichman Toch. Jane is a longstanding faculty member of the McGill Executive Institute and a specialist in such areas as emotional intelligence, coaching, and leadership. And Pamela Sorrenti, our Director of Public Programs, is going to be your moderator for today's session. So thanks again for attending, literally from around the world. Glad to have you all. And with that, let's get started. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you so much, Eric, and welcome everyone. And good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today with all of you. And we're going to be looking at managing your relationships in your organization. And we're going to be focusing on the most important relationship that you have, and that's the one with your manager. But before we get started, let's hear from you and let's do a little check-in. So how are you coming in today? And choose the number that best represents how you're feeling right now. And there's a poll that was put up, so let's see how people are feeling.
Hey, Jane, so everyone started to answer.
Thank you.
A real mix, but we've got a lot of Sunnies, which is nice. Sunnies winning at 34%, and about 60% have voted, so pretty good. We'll give it maybe a few more seconds. And, you know, it's pretty even across the board, but there are a lot of Sunnies, so that's really nice, because it is a bit of a gloomy day in Montreal, so I like to see some sunny
There's also some nice heart clouds and rainbows out there. So let's see what we can do. Maybe we can bring more people over to the sunny side by the time we finish. Thanks so much. So what does managing up mean to you? What are your assumptions about the boss-employee relationship that's really important? What responsibility do you think you have in managing your relationship with your manager? And, you know, very often when we use the terminology managing up, some people kind of look at it negatively. They look at it in terms of office politics or, you know, other types of relationships with their boss, however, whatever assumptions they make about it. But what I'd like to hear from you right now is, what are your assumptions? What do you think your responsibility?
Oh, Jane is freezing a little bit, so hopefully she'll be back in a minute. But in the meantime, we'll check out what everyone's saying. So figure out what they want or need and meet that. How they like things, make them look good by doing your work well. Open and honest communication, two-way communication, ensuring they have what they need from me, keeping them informed, making their jobs easier, having a trustful relationship. So there's a lot of communications in here, and keeping them informed, which is part of communication. So seeing them as partners, mutually respecting each other, aligning with boss and informing, especially about issues. So again, about communication. Influences in there for sure, transparency, virtual coffee, absolutely. And just open communication, Jane, I see is the biggest
okay. Can you hear and see me okay now?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Well, these are all amazing responses, all very, very constructive and positive responses. And I think what you're doing is you're recognizing what needs to be recognized, that effective managers take the time and effort to manage not only relationships with their subordinates, but also those with their bosses. So in terms of communication, mutually working together, mutual understanding, the fact is that your manager is the most important person in your organization for you. So when we talk about managing up, what we're looking at is the process of consciously working with your manager to obtain the best possible outcomes for you, for your manager, and for your organization. So it's really taking a conscious approach to building your relationship with your manager. So that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be stepping back. We're going to be focusing on building even a more effective working relationship with your manager, and seeing what are some of the strategies that you can use to do that. And the other question really is, what do you want to be known for? What is your brand? We talk a lot about branding, and we talk a lot about reputation. It takes a long time to build a good reputation.
So we seem to be having some technical difficulties with Jane's connection. Jane, I think maybe we'll turn your video off. It might help.
Okay.
Yeah. Jane, some of the comments are coming through are that they disagree that the most important person in the organization is the manager, and that it's really about their team. Do you have any comments on that?
Okay. Let me ask you, why do you think most people leave an organization? Do they leave because of their team?
Or leadership, money, because of the manager, because of their boss, bad boss, manager, because of their manager, feeling undervalued. Yeah, so that's
who are they feeling undervalued by? I mean, there's a lot of research that's been done on this. So I really appreciate the different responses as well. I think that's important. But, Gallup does a lot of work, and they really they do a lot of studies on motivation and engagement, and results of a recent Gallup poll, which encompassed more than 1 million workers, identify having a bad boss as a #1 reason employees quit their jobs. They estimate that employees spend about 19 hours a week worrying about what a boss does or does. And according to psychologists, 75% of adult employees credit their boss for work-related stress. So there are a number of factors, and your boss is not the only important person. However, your career might be sort of blocked by your boss. Your efficacy within the organization may be blocked by your boss, because you're really depending on your boss to get information, to have access to certain people, to have access to others across the organization. So for those reasons, I'm focusing on the boss as the most important person for you. Any comments or thoughts on that?
Without a good boss, you can't do anything. Very true, Miriam. A good manager shines when the team functions well in the manager's absence.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah.
So again, what do you want to be known for? Do you want to be known as the person who's adaptable and flexible and works well with others? Or, a lot of times there's some very smart and hardworking people, but they just don't, they just don't progress as well as they should, because of the fact that they may have difficulty, working in a team or working with their boss. And Theodore Roosevelt at the turn of the century said the most important single ingredient in the formula for success is knowing how to get along with people. I mean, it was true then and it's true now. So the way I'm looking at it is that it's a relationship of mutual dependence of two fallible human beings. So you need each other to be successful. And you've talked about that in the chat from what Pam shared with me earlier. Your boss is relying on you to help, and they need cooperation and dependability in order for them to get their job done. And they have a boss too, and they have to fulfill their boss's working relationship with them. So
seems like we lost you there, Jane. You might want to repeat.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
I really apologize. I don't know what's going on. My internet, anyways, I'll repeat. So to go back to what I was saying about the relationship of mutual dependence, should I start there, Pam?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So what I was saying is that you need each other and you're both fallible human beings and you bring strengths and challenges. And it's important. Sometimes people don't realize how much their boss depends on them because your boss is relying on you to help and they need your cooperation and they need you to be dependable for them to get their job done. They have pressures coming down from their boss and their boss has expectations. And as I mentioned earlier, you're relying on your boss in order to perform your job well, having access to information, to other parts of the organization. They're just a couple of examples of what you need from your boss. So it's really important to look at this relationship in a thoughtful way in order to see what can be done to make sure that you're both as successful as possible. So where does this fit in the bigger picture? Those of you who know me a little bit know my passion about emotional intelligence. And this is really where managing your relationships and in particular managing your boss really fit in. And the goal of emotional intelligence, people with high emotional intelligence are the ones who build effective relationships. And your relationships are critical in terms of your success within organization. So there are two sides to this model. On one side, we look at personal competencies, how we manage ourselves. And then on the other side, we look at social competencies, how we manage our relationships. So the more that you build your awareness of yourself, how you operate, what are your strengths, what are your challenges, what might be some potential hot buttons or triggers that you have, and the more that you build your awareness and ability to manage yourself, how do you motivate yourself when things aren't going well? What do you do when you are in conflict with someone? How do you manage those conflicts? And then if we look over at the other side, social competencies, how well do you manage your relationships? And social awareness is really understanding how other people operate. That's where empathy comes in. So being able to put yourself in the shoes of another person to see things from their perspective. And then finally, relationship management, as I mentioned, is really the success point of emotional intelligence. How well you're managing your relationships is key to your success. So we're going to be looking at building awareness for yourself, as well as awareness of the way that your boss operates. So here are some questions that we can be asking ourselves. And as I go through these questions, I think it would be good for you to think about them for yourself as well as for your manager. And if you have your computer screen open and you can take some notes, or if you have some paper and pen or pencil to work with, that will be helpful as well. So you start by gathering information. Do you have a good understanding of yourself? Do you know what your strengths are? Do you know where your challenges lie? Do you know what you need to be effective? Do you know what your blind spots are? And what's your preferred working style? And how about your communication style? And then ask the same questions about your manager. What are their strengths and challenges? What do they need? Are you aware of what their needs might be? Can you see their blind spots? And that's an opportunity for you to step in and help them. Do you understand what their preferred working style is and what their preferred communication style is? Very often people can run into issues or even conflict. And just because we operate differently, we have different ways of seeing things and we have different ways of working. And sometimes those different ways can get in the way unless we understand them. So some questions again for you to ask yourself. What helps you and what hinders you in working with your boss? Some people are less comfortable with people in authority, and they bring that kind of assumption or framework to their relationship with their boss. If that's you, then you should be aware of that and you should manage that. You may have just very different perceptions of how to get things done effectively, and sometimes that can create conflict. So do you understand the different ways that you work? And do you understand that sometimes those different ways are exactly what you need, that you could be complementing each other, even though it may feel like there's some conflict there? Are their expectations of you clear to you? Do you know what your boss expects and needs from you? And if they're not clear, then you're not going to be able to achieve them. So a conversation is in order. So, I understand sometimes bosses may not be easy to work with, but the more you can understand them, the more you can put yourself in their shoes and see things from their perspective, the more you'll be able to build a relationship that works for both of you. So, yes?
I'll just stop in as Miriam's has a pragmatic question for you. So
Right.
in relation to the grid that you just showed, that can be a really helpful tool. How do you start completing the grid? Is it a self-reflective exercise? Are you answering those questions for your boss or for your working group member? Or do you have a conversation with them in order to start kind of uncovering these potential blind spots?
Well, I think the starting point should really be for you to do some research for yourself, to reflect on this and to better understand, think back to conversations that you have, or maybe even performance conversations that you've had. Think back to things that people may be appreciating you for. Think back to things that you appreciate yourself for. Think about those areas where you may feel challenged and you may need to get out of your comfort zone. I mean, I would say the starting point is really a reflection, a personal reflection. And then I think if a conversation may be warranted with your manager as well as with your team. Sometimes if you're leading a team, you can ask people what's working for you, what's not working for you, in terms of how we communicate, in terms of how we work together, and get that, diversity of opinion out on the table.
Great, thanks. I think that was helpful.
Thanks, Miriam. So this is something for you to think about and just even make some notes about as we go through this. Do you know what your manager's greatest pressures are right now? And do you know what their top organizational priorities are right now? And what about yourself? What are your greatest pressures right now? What are your top organizational priorities right now? And if you don't have that information or it's not clear to you, then definitely a conversation is in order for you to make sure that you and your manager are both on the same page. You understand what they need right now, and they also need to understand what you need. So it's a two-way conversation. It's not just a one-way street. And here you can ask yourself, where and how can you contribute to your manager's priorities? And where and how can you align your goals and priorities? So that's the animated portion of the presentation. So that was a joke. So Pam, do we have any comments on this? Are people picking up on what's expected of them and what their manager's priorities and pressures might be right now?
So somebody's asking to go back to the previous slide. And a question is, what do you do when your manager is unable to do so? And I assume that they mean, and Agnes, please correct me if I'm wrong, but unable to tell you about their biggest pressures. What do you do about that?
When they can't.
Yes, when they're not allowed to disclose the pressures that they're having. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, then I'm afraid that that's a very difficult situation to be in. If your manager isn't allowed to disclose their greatest pressures, then that kind of works against the best practice that in organizations we should be able to communicate as much as possible, as much as we can communicate to others in terms of what's going on. And that's really what builds trust. So that's a difficult situation that you're in. And I think that you just need to cope as well as you can cope.
Fair point. Anna's making a point about how blind spots vary across generational working teams and groups. And I think some people are realizing that they do have blind spots, which is an important realization.
Absolutely. I mean, we all have blind spots. And that's really where having a strong relationship with others is key, because that way we can learn about ourselves, and that can help us close those blind spots, or at least bring awareness to them. So those elements are key. So again, are your mutual expectations clear? And I guess from what I'm hearing, that in some cases they are, and in some cases they're not. And as much as possible, it's important, whether you're a manager or whether you're working, we're talking about working with your manager, it's very important to create a context where you can share these things more easily, because that way, that's just building team, and that's building effectiveness. And it's critical that we support each other in those ways. So let's just talk about some elements to look at. And as I go through these various categories, think about your manager. Where do they fit in? And also, where do you fit in? And how may this help and how may this hinder? So let's start with working style. So are you someone who's highly organized and highly structured? Is that your manager as well? What about moderately organized and structured? What about little organization or structure? And what else? Maybe something different. So I was working with a client, and she was having some issues with her boss because she likes to get things done well in advance of a deadline, and her boss is much more of a last minute person. So they would do presentations together, and the night before a presentation, her boss would be sending out slides to be incorporated in the presentation. And this was creating a lot of stress and anxiety for her, to a point where she was thinking of, moving to a different department. So we talked about it, and she learned to approach her boss and discuss which portion of the presentation she would be responsible for. And then she would get her part done in advance. And then she'd also be available to support her boss's last minute approach. So being aware of it and managing what she could manage helped bring down the stress level of the situation for both of them. So I think what's important here is to try not to be judgmental, and it really is so easy to be judgmental, but just to look at the fact that we do things differently. And building that awareness, we can also build strategies of how to manage those differences the most effectively. Then is, reader or listener? Is your manager a reader or listener? Some people like to get written information in advance and then have a discussion. Other people like to have a discussion first and then have that followed up by a written report. John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, he was somebody who was definitely a reader, and he'd like to get lots of information in advance lots of briefing information before he sat down and had a conversation. When Lyndon Johnson took over, and there was very little time to transition, John F. Kennedy's staff were still in place, and they treated Lyndon Johnson the same way they'd been treating Kennedy. And Johnson wasn't a reader, he was a listener. So he was deluged with all of this information, and he didn't quite know what to do with it. So they had to really understand what his preference was. What about data preference? Does your manager like verifiable facts and concrete data, or are they more conceptual and theoretical, or maybe a mix of the two? But being aware of that is key, because that way, when you do present data, you're presenting it in a way that is amenable to them, in a way that they can understand it and they can relate to it the most easily. And what about conflict? What is your manager's sort of approach or perspective around conflict? And this is really important. It can have an enormous effect on how your manager is managing their subordinates, as well as any difficult interactions they may be having with their peers that can impact them. So, if your manager is conflict averse, what can you do to help them with that? Perhaps to find a way to approach the situation that makes it easier for them. So the next area is preferred decision-making style. Does your manager like more of a linear step-by-step process, focusing on logic so they can see how to get to the end result step by step? Or are they more values-based, taking into consideration how other people might feel? Or is there a mix of the two, or is it something different? So by understanding their decision-making style, again, you can approach them in a way that they can best hear you, and they'll be the most amenable to working with the data that you're presenting to them. We talk about often people communicate to other people in a way that they wish to be communicated to. What's really important here is to step back, put yourself in the shoes of the person to whom you're communicating, and understand, what do they need to hear? What do they need to see? How do they need to see and hear it in order to make their decision? And then finally getting to introvert or extrovert. And this is pretty key. The main distinction between introversion and extroversion is really, where do you get your energy? Do you get your energy from the exterior, from other people? Do you like to think out loud? Do you like to process externally, or do you like to process internally? If you're an extrovert, you most likely enjoy meetings in large groups. And if you're an extroverted manager, you probably like to have lots of meetings. If you're an introvert, you process internally and you prefer fewer meetings. And generally you prefer meeting with one person at a time. So again, something to think about in terms of how you're working with your boss. If you're an extrovert with an introverted boss, you may like to have more meetings, and the reverse is true as well. But I think the key point really is understanding personality differences is key to effective collaboration and teamwork. Before I started doing the work that I'm doing now, I practiced law for 12 years. And I worked for a real estate developer. I was in-house counsel for a real estate developer. And it was a hugely dynamic organization. It was very go, go, go. And I worked with the president quite a bit, as well as with the vice president, and their communication styles were so different. And what they needed from me was so different. So I knew that the president really didn't want a lot of information. He didn't want my analysis. He just wanted me to give him an answer. Can we move forward with this or not move forward with this? Whereas the vice president was very different. He was really interested in understanding all the details. He wanted to understand all the information. It was a much longer process working with him. There'd be numerous meetings and lots of drafting and redrafting. But understanding his needs and understanding the president's needs were key. And I think the important point too was the fact that they were very different personalities. They worked very differently, but they were hugely complementary. Pam, do we have any questions or comments?
Yeah, there's a lot of chat going on, Jane, about how this is, kind of like couples therapy, but for you and your boss. And it's so true. We spend so much time with our colleagues and our bosses, more time than our significant others. So I thought those were some really good parallels that people were drawing.
Yeah. Those are great parallels. And I think what's really important, again, is to just not judge. And that might be a difficult thing to do because you're impacted by your boss so significantly. But if you can remove the judgment and just kind of step back and view yourself and view your boss more objectively, and just kind of see what needs to be tweaked or what needs to be worked on so that you can become a better team.
Yeah, and not assume what the intention was of an action, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
There was a question here about maybe providing some tips on how you can have more of these courageous conversations with your team. This might not come easily to everyone. So what are some tips you might give someone?
To have courageous conversations?
Yeah.
Well,
about the personality differences and about how things are working.
Well, I think what's really important is to start building, if you don't already have them, to start building trusting relationships and trusting conversations. And I remember a few years ago, I was working with a team, I was working with a group of leaders, and this was before COVID, and when people were just beginning to work virtually, and these were leaders of virtual teams. And we all know that it's challenging. Virtual teams are more challenging in terms of connecting, and especially when they were located around the world, so they didn't have an opportunity to work well together. And one of the team leads asked me, what can I do to get my people to trust me? And I told them, you have to trust them first. You have to trust them first. And that might entail being vulnerable. And that will entail sharing how you're feeling. But I think, for these courageous conversations, you have to have good intentions, and you have to make sure that those good intentions, that you communicate intentions, that you have a positive intent, that you don't have a hidden agenda, that you're really in good faith, and your goal is really to better understand the other person so that you can work effectively together. You know, it's interesting because I work with teams, and with the McGill Executive Institute, with different clients, as well as we have public programs. And I work with assessments quite often. And what I really like about assessments is that they show differences in terms of how we perceive the world, in terms of what's important to them, to different people, but the differences are depersonalized. So I think what's important is not making it personal. One isn't good or bad, they're just different. And we need that diversity in terms of complementing each other, and effectiveness grows from that. So, I mean, that would really be my go-to. Bring positive intention, really show your care about the other person, be vulnerable, you know, and build trust that way.
Thanks, Jane. That's really helpful.
So I'm going to move on to compass points. So this is taken from the personality compass, a new way to understand people. And again, what we're doing is we're looking at different personalities and different preferences. So I want to preface this by saying that we all have a mixture of all of these different compass points. One isn't good and another one isn't bad. They're just different. So I'm going to go through them. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to think about which one you relate to for yourself and which one you think applies to your manager. So I'd like to start off with North. So North is the leader. They like to take leadership. They like to take charge. Their motto is, let's do it. Let's get it done. So they like to act, they like to try different things, and they like to plunge in. So other attributes are very much of a faster pace, task-oriented, goal-centered. So really the goal is to, fulfill the goal, achieve the task. They're going to be more assertive, decisive. There's going to be a sense of more competition and independent. So their focus is really on taking charge and getting things done. So just think for a moment, is that you? Is that your manager? And let's move on to the next one. So East, their motto would be, let's expand our horizons and let's think big. So they will begin with the end in mind, but then look at all the possibilities before they act. So people with this orientation are big picture thinkers, very idea-centered and focused. They're innovative, they're creative, they're flexible, spontaneous, free-spirited, enthusiastic, visionary. You can even hear the energy in all of these words in terms of the way that they like to operate. And as we go through these, I think you can also start noticing how they really are quite different, and how there's a potential for, disagreement or misunderstanding that can come from the fact that we all have a certain preference in terms of how we operate. If we talk about West, so these are the people who say, let's do it right, and let's do it right the first time. So they're detail-oriented, they're organized, quality-centered, a lot of analysis and logic comes in. They focus, they're structured, they're perfectionistic tendencies because they want to make sure that they've covered off everything. And they like to know the who, what, when, where, and why before they take any action. And finally, we're getting to the South. So the South are the caring team players, and their motto would be, let's build the best team, and maybe the best team ever. And so they like to know, they want to make sure that everyone's voice has been heard and everyone's feelings have been taken into consideration before acting. So again, think about the tension that might occur with other compass points, with other styles. So they're slower paced, they're good listeners, sensitive, non-confrontational, very patient and understanding, generous in terms of their help, and they're very helpful. So I'll just give you a moment to think about that and think about which one suits you the best.
There's a few questions while while people are reflecting, Jane. Some people are saying, I think I have a little bit of everything in me. So what does that mean?
Well, I think we all have a little bit of everything, but is there one that really speaks to you the most? Or maybe you're really across the board, maybe you've incorporated all of these. But let me just ask you, I think the question would be really, when you're in a stressful situation, where do you go?
Right.
Do you move forward like the leader? Do you take charge? Do you start brainstorming even more and coming up with even more ideas? Do you hunker down and make sure that all the details are there and they're perfect, and maybe slow down a little bit to ensure that everything is being done right? Or are you sort of slowing things down and making sure that everybody's voice is being heard?
Makes a lot of sense. People in the chat are also noticing some parallels between, this kind of style as well as the insight discovery, or insight discovery, as well as the what's another one, the four.
Well, I think what people are seeing is that there are certain key personalities or core personalities that come up in different assessments.
Yeah.
So there are patterns that we see through them. What's important though is to recognize your pattern and recognize other people's patterns. And so look at them in terms of how, you can flex your pattern, your style to work with others and so on. So anything else, Pam, before we move on?
Yeah, so somebody was asking how, these assessments are wonderful and they can really give you insights into yourself and potentially even others. How do you implement the learnings from those assessments to your team if you've done it as a team exercise? So somebody here has done the Clifton Strengths with their team. How can you bring it to, how do you implement the learnings from that over time?
Well, I mean, I think that there should be, first of all, an understanding and agreement to share your results with each other. So that should be number one part of the process. And then I would just say that bringing awareness to the way that you're operating and just kind of stepping back and, at the end of a meeting or at the beginning of a meeting, even putting that structure proactively on the table so you can see who is operating, like who has which preference and what might be missing. Because sometimes when I work with teams, I'll come in and I work with one profile where inevitably there's a lot of people in 3 of the 4 quadrants and not very many in the 4th quadrant. So then it's a question of what do we need to do to make sure that we're flexing our style so that we're covering all the bases. So I think it's a really interesting way of working with a framework.
And can you develop yourself in the areas that you're not as strong in or not as, that are not your go-to? So if I'm a South thinker or a South, that's my go-to, can I develop myself in the other areas?
100%. So, okay, surprise, surprise, I'm a South thinker. So, caring team player. And one of the things sometimes, and I'm kind of a mixture of that and the West in terms of careful thinkers. So I'm somebody who analyzes, who slows things down, who goes through things in detail. And sometimes that's appropriate and sometimes it's just too much. So what I've learned to do is to sort of stop and pause and say, okay, what do I need to do here? And I will borrow some strengths from the North at that point. I need to be, decisive, faster paced, goal oriented, and I need to move forward. So when I was practicing law, I was doing that intuitively because I worked with a very North cultured organization. So I had to just move forward with that. But you can do it very consciously. You can think, is the way I'm operating right now appropriate, or can I just move forward with the decision? Same if you're North focused. You can stop and think, do I need to enlist people at this point to hear from people, what's going on for them? So absolutely, and that's part of emotional intelligence. The importance is building awareness of yourself, how you operate, seeing where your strengths are and seeing where your challenges are, and then borrowing from other strengths.
So something you said earlier about, how you were, when you were working at a law firm, Yvonne here has a question. Is there a correlation in this research between style and position. So for example, is a director more of a south thinker, or, and then, you know, managers are more a north thinker? Is there some correlation in the position that you hold?
Well, I mean, I can just tell you from my own personal experience that different sort of, I'm gonna just call them colors for now, or personality styles show up in different positions for sure. I was working with one organization, and the majority of the people in the session were in sales. And there was a lot of red in terms of driving, goal-oriented, task-oriented. Not to say that there weren't other styles in there as well, because we do the same job, but for different reasons, and we bring different strengths to them. I think there's a certain type of manager that's been promoted for a long time. Like we've had a picture of what a heroic leader looks like for a long time, and that's connected to, you know, fast-paced, you know, task-oriented, moving the organization forward. But I think that that's changing a lot, because we're changing our thoughts around the types of leadership that organizations really need. And I mean, at this point, we're talking a lot about the importance of leaders who coach and the importance of empathic leaders. So, you know, we're bringing in a mix of different, you know, capabilities or competencies or approaches in order to be effective. So it's not necessarily like one style will fit any position. Then I was working once with a group of accountants, and you would imagine that they would all be careful thinkers, but they were across the board. They all had different reasons, different motivations for being there.
Great, thanks, Jane. Good point.
Okay, so I'm going to move on. The question is, what do you need from the other styles to be at your best? And what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite, as I go through this, so North, what do you need from the other styles to be at your best? And if you could put that in the chat.
So anyone who's, you know, primarily a North style, what do you need from others?
And put North at the beginning of your comments so that we know that that's who you are.
Great point, Jane. That'll be helpful. Be direct, get to the point.
Sorry, go ahead.
So what they need is for people to be direct and get to the point, to be fast and action oriented. North should rely heavily on West and South. People need to run with tasks. They need to get on board quickly. They need to be, North needs to be empowered. They need autonomy. Slow me down and question me. That's interesting. Commit to the goal, even if you have a different way of getting there, right? Many roads lead to Rome.
I like that.
Yeah. I need people to propose ideas and ensure to be heard. Speak up if they can't execute on the task. Be clear about what you need to get things done. So I'm seeing a lot of get to the point, get clear instruction, moving forward.
Okay.
How can we encourage North to be more empathetic? That's interesting.
Okay, well, we're going to move on then, because we're going to hear from the other styles too. Absolutely. And I really like those contributions. Thank you. So what about East? What do you need to be at your best? What do you need from the other styles?
So East, data and open to suggestions, open to new ideas, trust freedom, open to contribute to ideas, brainstorming, don't block ideas, embrace change. To be genius brainstormers and trust, communication and brainstorming, open communication, flexibility, thinking outside the box.
Fantastic.
So, yeah.
Okay, so these are, I mean, and if you listen to, we need all of these things, right? And the fact is that we all want to accomplish tasks. We all want to accomplish our goals. We just have different ways of going about them. And what about West? What about the careful thinkers? What do you need from the other styles to be at your best?
Okay, so West, we're starting with facts. Have all the details. I need to understand the big picture, and it needs to make sense. A little space and goodwill, encouragement. The turtle wins the race. We'll question everything. Facts, data, risks, options, facts, clarity on the goal. Again, questions, a lot of question marks.
Yeah, exactly. They want to dig into it and make sure that they have all the information before they move forward. And last but not least, South, caring team player. What do you need from others to be at your best?
So let's see. Collaboration, engagement. Not too many South thinkers on the call. Everyone to be happy.
Everyone to be happy.
People that are not South but understand the importance of this, line of thinking. Fair goals, taking into account where the team is at, clear directives and helpful motivation. Empathy is big. Empathy, impact on others, response to others, feedback. South checking in on how everyone is feeling, leading through empathy.
Okay. And I mean, that's all of these elements are really critical. And when we talk about the South side or the people side, there's a lot of change going on in organizations, and studies have shown the importance of really engaging the people side of things, making sure that everyone's voice or people's voices are heard. Very often what happens is that, companies may have the most brilliant strategy. They've worked very hard on putting their strategy together, but it's not always successful because they haven't taken into consideration the people side of things. And sometimes people will resist changes that they would have agreed to otherwise because they haven't been engaged. So, we all want to accomplish goals. We all want to make sure that we're good listeners, that people have an opportunity to speak, but we all have, or these different preferences show that different styles have different ways of leading that. So based on what we've talked about so far, I'd like to hear from you in the chat. I'd like to give you a minute to think about this, since I am South. So what are you taking away from this exercise? Based on on what you've learned so far today, what is one thing that you can start doing to improve your working relationship with your manager?
So Bridget's saying she wants to bring this up with her manager. She wants to discuss it with them. So that's great. Understand, put yourself in his or her shoes. Learn preferred styles and personalities, setting and matching expectations, being mindful of their woes and aware of their management personality. Step in their shoes and self-reflect. Assess and adapt to their assess and adapt to their style. Adaptation. There's a lot of adaptation here, which is great. Starting with self-awareness, and we often come back to self-awareness in these webinars. I think it's so key. Agree to work through the self-reflection first, and then discuss and align the goals and pressures for each. We all need to recognize that we and our bosses may have different styles. This is great. So there's a lot of, understanding throughout that's coming out through the chat.
And the fact of the matter is that when we are in stressful situations like we are right now, it's even more important to take a step back and to build that connection and to build that understanding with others. Great. Is there anything else, Pam, that's come up?
Miriam is saying, one of the biggest challenges I face is that we get along well because we are all very similar, possibly too similar, and we have to think more actively about other ways of thinking. That's a very...
That's a really great point. Yeah. And it's true, we get along best with people who are like us. It's easiest for us. But if you're looking at what you need in order to be the most successful. And it's been shown very clearly through research that teams and organizations that are diverse are the ones that are the most successful on every level. And that's where it's really important to embrace differences and not to see them as obstructions, but to see them as potential blind spots that you may have. If you have a certain way of acting, a certain way of operating, and somebody else, you feel like someone is blocking that, that might bring you into conflict. But if you can reframe that and see that as a potential to get some information that you may be missing to help you be even more effective, then that relationship is going to change, and your approach to working with people with very different styles is going to change. It's more difficult when we're under stress, there's no question. But that's also when I think it's even more important to step back and to look at different perspectives.
I think we're all under a lot of stress right now, just given our global situation.
We are under a lot of stress. So important to be able to bring that stress down for yourself as much as possible, and recognize what you need to take care of yourself in terms of the way that you're working, in terms of the way that you're operating as well. Pam, I know we have a few minutes left for questions, so I would also invite, if anybody has a question for a different style, a different compass point, to be able to ask that question in chat. Is there anything you want to know about the way another compass point operates? Are there any questions on that?
Okay. So someone's bringing up, while all of this is very interesting, this person sees, a little bit of an issue with putting people into a box. What can you say to that?
I agree. Like, I don't think the intention is not to put people into boxes. The intention is just to better understand what different preferences may be in order to work more clearly and communicate more effectively with that person. So I think what's really important here is, and thank you for that question, I think it's a great question. What's really important here is for you not to look at your boss and say, okay, my boss is north, and I'm only going to see my boss through that lens, and everything about them is going to be north focused. There's so much more to each of us than, these different styles. The style is just there. The conversation around the style is there to help you better understand differences. But absolutely, you shouldn't categorize somebody as a specific way and, oh, there they go, that's just what they do. There's much more to them than that. So thank you for that question.
Human beings are very complex.
Absolutely.
Okay, so is there a general rule on how to approach each of the compass points? I think that lends itself to, is there a general rule to how you would speak to someone who lends themselves more to the East thinker?
I'm sorry that you cut out a little bit, the last part, Pam.
So is there a general rule on how to approach each of the types of thinkers? I think that that was part of the exercise that we did when we asked, the North thinkers what they needed, the East thinkers what they needed. So is there any other information that you could provide this person on a way to communicate, how to approach them?
Well, I think you really need to listen to them and listen to the language that they're using, listen to the words that they're using. And you're going to pick up on what's important to them through doing that. If somebody look at the way they make decisions. Do they stop and they analyze? Do they need more information? So it's just really by observing each other. And then if you're not sure, just ask the question. If you don't know if somebody's a reader or a listener, just ask them, would you like me to get you this information ahead of time so you can look through it before we meet? Or are you okay for us to review this in our meeting and I'll send you the follow-up documentation later? And I think that in general, people are very happy to share and think about what their preference would be. And they probably will appreciate the question as well.
Yeah, just what do you need from me, right?
Exactly.
There's been quite a little bit of chat around trust. I'm kind of combining different comments and questions here, but you know, some people are starting as a new manager on a team that is well formed and they're the new manager, so the new person in, there's a lack of trust. There's some people that are just, you know, how do you give away trust instead of build it? The idea of trust is kind of a question mark.
I think you build trust. Like, think about the best relationship that you have with somebody, a trusting relationship. So how have you built trust with that person? Chances are you've had disagreements. And so what I would say is that, you know, sharing who you are is important. Being open to feedback is important. Giving feedback is important. Understanding that conflict may be difficult, but isn't bad, in the sense that I know for myself personally, some of the best relationships that I have are ones where we've had disagreements, where we haven't seen eye to eye, and we've, you know, resolved those disagreements in a very constructive and respectful way. So you're going to build trust by being yourself and by being open to feedback and by, you know, being well-intentioned and caring enough to give feedback to others as well.
And Anna here, she says, we win trust through our actions and decisions, and those are constant, they're every day, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, like we always say, Pam, we judge ourselves by our intentions and we judge others by their behaviors. So behaviors are what people can see. And so absolutely, Anna, they are critical.
There was a question here about the types again. So going back, Jane, you mentioned that you were a South type. Did you ever want to change to a different type? Was there a time in your life where you said, I'm a red and I want to be a blue? And do you think that the environment around you shaped your style?
Did I ever want to be a different well, I mean, I've flexed my style to work in different situations. And yeah, like I enjoy, did I ever want to be a different style? That's a hard question to answer. I mean, I enjoy elements of all of those styles, to be very honest with you. And I really appreciate the value that each style brings. So I try and incorporate, I'm principally a South, I bring in other things, but I try and incorporate the strengths of the other styles where I think they can help me and where they're going to be effective.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I'm just going to ask one last time. Is there any? I think we have time for maybe one question. So I'll look through here if I missed anything. Somebody referred to, think about a magician that cuts off your arms and legs. Like, I think we're referring to boxing in parts of, you know, your thinking styles. Think about the magician, about the magician presenting. The knife box cuts off body parts to know the truth by interventions. Count the trust ratio. It's interesting. All right. Okay. Well, I think that is it for questions. There's a lot of comments, a lot of chat. Somebody shared a resource here on leadership in the age of complexity. Thank you, Joan, for that. Do you have any closing remarks, Jane, that you wanted to mention before we close off?
No, I mean, my closing remarks are just really to thank all of you for being here. I think it's really impressive that you take the time to learn more about yourself and learn how to make your working relationships more effective. So that, I think, is a very positive and very hopeful thing. So thank you so much.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Jane, for making this session such a success. There were so many insightful comments, and thanks everyone who participated as well. There was so much great chat, which was amazing. You will be receiving in the next 24 hours an email from us with the recording of the session, some of the resources Jane spoke about, you know, the grid that you can kind of use, as well as some additional resources and a feedback survey that we would really appreciate if you could fill out. There's a section in there to tell us what other kinds of sessions you would like to attend. This is actually our last Level Up webinar series for the fall. So I wish everyone a happy, safe holiday, and we'll see you back in the spring. Really looking forward to that. So hopefully you stay in touch, and have a great day, everyone.